And she cries out, "Must a Christ suffer in every generation for those who have no imagination?" Would that we, who would defend truth at the cost of tolerance, could listen to the words of Cromwell, who was himself a pretty unsavory character, but who spoke to the Scottish Parliament and appealed to them rather than going to war where they would support the crown rather than the parliamentarians of Cromwell's group. "I appeal to you," he said, "body of Christ, to consider that you may be wrong." So I have mixed feelings about tolerance. Some good things, some bad things. I would add just a couple of words about the nature of truth. Basically, for the sake of time, I'm just going to simply say this. I think it would be the height of arrogance on my part to say that I could add anything to the intellectual discussion of truth. For my money, I've been teaching this stuff a long time, there's nothing, absolutely nothing that's been added of any substance to the conversation since the days of Immanuel Kant, and we're talking 250, almost 300 years ago. This discussion pretty well was over with people like, and you know the names, Descartes and Hume and all the rest. With the juncture of the Renaissance precipitated the rise of the Enlightenment, and people began to rediscover the insights of the Greek Hellenistic age when the new science came forth. And we began to wonder the real crux of the matter, whether people could discover anything that was helpful that wasn't grounded in the truth of God. Is it possible to find meaning in life without God? Is it possible to do ethics without God? And I think tonight we've heard the assertion, no, it's not. At least without truth. But that's something that I think we have to consider, and I would hope that maybe now we can go on. My time is up, right? Yeah. It is, okay. And so I won't stop there because there's a lot more that could be said, but maybe this will come out in the discussion. Is that all right with you? Let's do it.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to skip the.
Could you speak up, please?
Unfortunately, we're going to have to skip the questioning between the debaters. We're going to go straight to the audience questions in order to give all of you who came here time to ask the debaters your own questions. So I ask that you only ask one question. You ask it clearly. You ask it concisely. Please offer no statements. I cannot emphasize this enough, so there's a lot of people here. We want to get to all your questions, so please make it concise. With that, I will call on, yes, sir.
I was just curious about the meatpacking versus the public school teacher thing.
Yeah.
Now, were those modern day public school teachers that you were comparing?
Oh yeah, back in the 60s, 70s.
That's all.
I have to be careful when I talk about anything historical because most of my students, some of which are sitting right here and over there, you mentioned Kennedy's or Martin Luther King Jr., any of these events, the Second World War, and let's see, the Second World War. So the 60s a long time ago, Vietnam. What's your?
That's it. I was just curious if they were the public school students that were studied by the philosopher that you were that you were talking about, or if you actually did a survey yourself.
Only with the meatpacking people.
Right.
But I use the same instrument, and it's very easy to use. But I have no reason to believe that our public school teachers are much different from what they were then. And I don't know what your experience has been, but I still reap the dividends of school systems that, you know, the old notion, people love their chains. They learn to love their chains. And when I put them in an environment, when I say, hey, take your chains off, you know, many people are uncomfortable doing that. They want to be told what to do, and that's a frightening thing. And unfortunately, I have no reason to believe that teaching at a university level is a heck of a lot different. And I think, well, it could very well be. And I think you have a real problem in a land-grant institution where the emphasis may be more on training than on education. I don't know. This would be a fun debate to have with our faculty here, but I don't think land-grant schools are different from any other schools of higher education. We really do, and I think the argument training and education is an old one, and much of it has to do with this business about truth. And do we teach the eternal verities and so on, and etc. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. You think you're in charge?
Sir,
I'd like to ask the Reverend a question. When you speak of truth...
Can you speak as loudly as you can?
I'd like to ask the Reverend a question.
Yeah, please call me Martin. Don't call me Reverend. Martin. Martin.
Martin, thank you. Martin, I'd like to ask you a question about your conception of truth. You speak of it almost as though it were a person. You describe it as laying things out and being non-coercive, being very persuasive. And I'm wondering why you give it this particular, as though it exists outside of individuals, outside of people. Now, the reason I raise this question is, doesn't your conception of truth allow it or obscure the fact that it is instrumental, that actually there is a person who is proposing that truth, who is a truth monger, who is providing some sort of a communication to someone else and intending to convince the other person that this is the truth? And should we ask, who are these people? Who are these truth tellers? And why should we listen to them?
Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. I speak of truth almost as a person for the same reason that Tom speaks of tolerance in terms of empathy. And what other terms were used here? Kindness, consideration. Why didn't you ask Tom this question about tolerance? Human language is using metaphor at every term. And this is what I do when I speak about truth. I use metaphors. So when I speak of truth as being not coercive, but being persuasive, I use a metaphor, of course. But that is what human language is. That is what it is built on.
But don't you agree that...
Excuse me, sir. Would you like to respond to the question?
Oh, well, I think I would. I think historically there are two theories of truth. One has to do with coherence. One has to do with help me out. Correspondence. Thank you very much. That word slipped right on my head. And I think what you heard from Martin was the coherence theory of truth. That is to say, you set forth certain kind of presuppositions or assumptions, and then you your statement has to cohere, be consistent with these. And that's one way of looking at truth. Unfortunately, I have a great deal of trouble with it because it calls for making those assumptions, many of which go unexamined, and they don't correspond to the real world that I live in. So I think there are two theories, and if they're both,
What is the second
don't have
theory?
somehow or another apply.
What is the second theory of truth, Tom? You talk of two. You mentioned one. What's the second one?
Yeah, correspondence it's called.
And what is that?
Oh, that the observations that result from your internal logic must apply to observations in the real world. They correspond to fact.
And this must is not a presupposition?
Oh, I don't think facts are presupposition.
No, but when you say that they must be investigated in a certain way, is that not a presupposition?
Well, sure.
Well, then you are basically arguing the same concept of truth.
But I could say that this folder is going to fall to the ground. Right?
Let it fall.
And this folder is going to fall to the floor.